The storm rolled across the lonely plains like a wounded beast searching for somewhere to rest, tearing through the night with claws of lightning that illuminated the widow. Clara Hale's small log cabin perched on the edge of the foothills, miles away from any settlement, where she lived alone after losing her husband to a mining accident 2 winters before. She had learned to survive the silence, to keep warm by the stove he built, to patch the roof he once climbed, and to whisper a prayer for strength every night as the wind howled around her. But on this particular evening, as thunder shook the valley and rain pounded the earth in furious sheets, something cut through the storm, something small, frantic and desperate, the faint sound of crying, thin as a thread and nearly swallowed by the roaring sky, yet unmistakably the cry of a child, and Clara, startled, wrapped her shawl tight and opened the door against the furious wind, only to see a small shadow stumbling toward her, soaked, shivering, and trembling in fear. Without hesitation she rushed forward, lifted the tiny figure in her arms, and carried him inside where the fire crackled cozily, revealing a boy of maybe 6 or 7 with muddy brown hair plastered to his face, clothing torn as if he had been riding or running for miles, cheeks red from cold and eyes wide with terror. Clara tried to ask him his name, but he only shook violently, unable to speak, so she fetched warm blankets, heated a cup of broth, and gently coaxed him to sip until the color returned to his lips, and slowly, painfully, the boy whispered that his name was Eli and he had been lost in the storm. After his horse was frightened by gunfire, yes, gunfire, he repeated with a stammer, explaining that men had chased him, big men with bandanas covering their faces, shouting things he didn't understand, men his father had once warned him about. Clara felt a chill deeper than the winter wind as she listened, because no child should speak of danger with such familiarity. Yet Eli's trembling made every word painfully real, and she soothed him, telling him he was safe here. No one would hurt him because this cabin, this frail wooden refuge, had more courage in its walls than any outlaw roaming the plains. And Eli, exhausted beyond resistance, fell asleep beside the warmth of the fire while Clara sat beside him throughout the night, watching the shadows flicker across the walls and wondering what kind of father loses a boy during a storm and what kind of men fire guns at a child. As the storm eased near dawn and the rain softened to a mist, Clara stepped outside to fetch firewood. But the moment she opened the door, her breath froze in her chest because stretching across the valley floor like black silhouettes, carved from the fading night, were riders, at least a dozen of them, mounted on massive horses, closing in on her cabin in a slow, menacing half-circle, their coats flapping like wings of crows, their faces almost invisible under wide-brimmed hats, and she instantly feared they were the same men Eli had described, until one rider, tall and broad-shouldered, raised a white cloth in the air as a gesture of peace. But Clara, alone and unarmed, stepped back, unsure whether to trust them, and the tall rider stopped a few steps from her porch, lowering his hood to reveal not a villain's face, but the rough, weather-worn features of a man who looked like he'd ridden through hell and back, searching for someone. And with a voice thick with worry, he asked, "Ma'am, have you seen a little boy? My boy, Eli, he vanished in the storm last night." Those words struck Clara like a hammer, and she instantly recognized the pain in his eyes as the kind no outlaw carried. This was a father, frantic and desperate, and as she opened her mouth to answer, Eli himself appeared behind her, rubbing his eyes, spotting the man, and crying out, "Pa!" before running to him, and the man dismounted so fast he barely touched the ground, dropping to his knees and pulling his son into his arms with a broken cry. The other riders softened at the sight, relief spreading across their faces as Eli clung to his father's neck. But as the reunion unfolded, Clara noticed something else in the father's eyes when he finally looked up at her, a mixture of gratitude, fear, exhaustion, and something darker, something he wasn't saying, something tied to why armed riders would surround her home at dawn. And she realized this story was far from over. This child appearing on her doorstep was no accident, and whatever hunted the boy might now also be hunting her. But the father stepped forward, hat in hand, introducing himself as Jacob Reed, rancher from the Northern Valley, known for being a fair but formidable man, and he thanked her with a sincerity so strong it almost shook her, telling her she had saved his entire world by saving his son. Yet before she could answer, another rider approached with haste, whispering something urgent in Jacob's ear, news that made his jaw tighten and his eyes narrow toward the tree line. Danger, Clara thought, a danger that came with the child, and now hovered over her cabin, like a shadow refusing to leave. And in that moment, Jacob asked something she did not expect. He asked her to let them stay, to let his riders guard her cabin for a few hours, until they were sure the ones chasing Eli were nowhere near, and Clara, despite the fear curling in her stomach, agreed with a slow nod, trusting the sincerity in Jacob's voice, unaware that her act of kindness had just entangled her in a feud deeper and deadlier than anything she had ever imagined. The morning sun had barely climbed above the dripping pines when the tension around Clara Hale's cabin thickened like fog, for although Jacob Reed's riders kept a tight perimeter and Eli sat safely inside near the glowing stove, there was an uneasy silence in the air, an unspoken truth that danger was closer than any of them wanted to admit. Clara, moved by compassion yet troubled by the way the riders scanned every shadow, finally asked Jacob what exactly had happened to his son. And Jacob, after a long pause filled with a father's torment, told her that Eli had seen something he was never meant to see, something that powerful men would kill to erase, a meeting deep in the canyon between a group of rustlers and a corrupt land baron, trying to steal control of the valley. Eli had followed his father earlier that day, wanting to prove himself brave, but in doing so, he witnessed the baron's secret transaction, names, faces, conversations that could bring an entire criminal ring crashing down if repeated to the law. And when the boy startled a horse as he tried to retreat, the men realized someone was watching and gave chase, forcing Jacob to send Eli racing home while he drew their attention away. But the storm had swallowed the boy, scattering him across the plains until fate pushed him to Clara's cabin. As Jacob spoke, Clara felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on her shoulders, realizing she had unknowingly placed herself between a child and men capable of killing without hesitation. Yet when she looked at Eli shyly warming his hands, she knew she would make the same choice again, because kindness wasn't something she performed only when convenient. It was who she was. But before Jacob could finish explaining the depth of the threat, a sharp whistle sliced the air outside, a signal from one of the riders, and instantly the relaxed posture around the cabin turned rigid. Horses stamped nervously, and every hand went to a gun. Clara's heart thudded painfully as Jacob stepped to the window, narrowing his eyes at the distant ridge where dark figures were beginning to appear. 3, no, maybe 5 riders at first, then more emerging from the trees like ghosts peeling out of the morning mist. Their movements slow, deliberate, and unmistakably hostile, because no traveler approached a guarded cabin in such formation unless they carried death in their saddlebags. Jacob grabbed Eli and pushed him gently toward Clara, instructing her to stay inside, lock the door and keep the boy down, promising he would not let harm come to either of them. But Clara, who had learned the hard way that fear does not protect one's home, refused to hide completely and stood at the window ready to help in whatever way she could. The rustlers came closer, their faces masked, rifles resting across their saddles, calling out taunts about returning a runaway witness, claiming they only wanted the boy back for a conversation, their words slick with poison. And when Jacob stepped onto the porch with calm defiance and told them they would not lay a single finger on his son, the leader laughed coldly, replying that the widow who sheltered him would pay the price as well. Clara's breath caught as one outlaw raised his gun and fired a warning shot into the air, and instantly Jacob's riders responded, forming a protective line, their horses shifting restlessly as the standoff crackled like thunder waiting to strike. The world held its breath until suddenly a shot rang out, not as a threat, but as an attack, and the battle erupted in a blur of smoke, hooves, and fury. Clara ducked instinctively, pulling Eli down with her as bullets tore splinters from the wooden walls, the cabin shaking under the storm of violence. And she prayed desperately that Jacob would survive, that the riders would not be outnumbered, that somehow mercy would triumph. Outside, Jacob moved with the precision of a man who'd fought for everything he loved, firing only when necessary, protecting his riders, pushing the outlaws back inch by inch until the rustlers, realizing they were facing not a grieving father but a force far stronger than they expected, retreated into the trees with curses and promises to return. When the gunfire ceased and the smoke drifted across the wet grass like a dying ghost, Jacob returned to the cabin, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, but his eyes blazing with determination, telling Clara the truth. He had left unspoken earlier that these men would not stop hunting Eli unless Jacob handed over evidence he didn't have or surrendered the boy to whatever cruel fate awaited him. Clara, shaken but resolute, looked him square in the eyes and said she would not let them face this alone, that Eli had come to her door for a reason, that maybe her quiet, lonely life had been preparing her for this moment when her kindness would mean more than a simple act, it would mean survival. Jacob, moved by her courage, admitted he had never met anyone with a soul as fearless as hers. And for the first time since his wife passed away years before, he felt something shift inside him, a warmth he had forgotten existed. The riders regrouped and strengthened their patrol, planning their next move, calculating how to get Eli safely to the sheriff without being ambushed. And as Clara packed food, water, and supplies for the dangerous journey ahead, she realized she was no longer just a witness or a bystander. She was part of a fight for justice, part of a story larger than anything she imagined. And as Eli hugged her tightly before mounting Jacob's horse, she knew she had become family to him in a way sorrowfully rare and beautifully unexpected. With the boy secured and the riders ready, Jacob turned to Clara one last time before leaving, promising he would return when this was over, promising that her bravery had changed not only his fate, but the fate of everyone in the valley.